We are at the heart of the European Union, which is the Schuman area in Brussels. Right behind me, you can see the Berlaymont building, which is the headquarters of the European Commission. That's also the place where the President Ursula von der Leyen lives and works. Right across the street, you can see the Europa building, which is the house of the member states. As we speak, it's entirely closed off, as all leaders of the 27 member states are convening to discuss the most pressing issues for the European Union. When we read the news, everything seems doom and gloom, and the problems seem bigger than their solutions, especially when we talk about the state of the European Union. But succumbing to nihilism and inactiveness would not only be foolish, but also historically wrong. Instead of pining for a great past and easy solutions, we should put things into perspective. First of all, we should recall that European integration has never been a purely idealistic project. To a great deal, it has always been driven by national, materialistic interests. Everything began with some simple materials indeed: coal and steel. In 1951, some European states asked themselves, what can we finally do to bring stability and peace to the continent? Their idea was simple yet radical. If we share the key resources needed to wage war, war becomes impossible. So let's transfer the control to a higher authority. And this was the birth of the European Coal and Steel Community, or, as it's also known in German, the Montanunion, a mining union. The idea was conceived by 6 pioneering states: France, Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. Today, 75 years later, we live in a European Union of 27 member states, and 9 more candidate countries are currently in the waiting room. That already demonstrates the power and the success of European integration. But it took many treaty revisions and many meetings of European leaders to get from a community for coal and steel to an economic community and a customs union, and finally to a European Union which also aligns its foreign and security policy. Until the mid-2000s, every few years there was an update to the treaties. Europe adjusted the EU to its challenges, politically and economically. And that's the first core feature of the European Union. Europe has always been shaped by crisis and pragmatic interests. And to increase its activeness, the EU has always refined its legal instruments as well as its institutions. Or to put it more simply, the EU has updated its computer regularly in its software and hardware. Indeed, the EU has seen many existential crises before. Quite well known is the empty chair crisis, when France boycotted the EU's ministerial meetings in the 1960s. That was just a few years after Europe expanded cooperation from steel and coal to even agriculture and trade. And very much forgotten is the so-called Eurosclerosis of the 70s and 80s. Europe faced high unemployment and little growth. At the same time, the political and economic integration process stagnated as well. Yet there have always been a few European leaders with a foresight and political acumen who chose to align their national interests and policies closer and closer. Take our Schengen area, for example. It started with a group of member states that agreed to remove border controls, and it only became later a project of the whole EU. The common currency, the euro, is another example of a so-called multi-speed Europe, where some members become frontrunners of integration. And that's the second core feature of the European Union. The EU has always been characterized by permanent tension between supranationalism and intergovernmentalism. In other words, the transfer of powers to the EU versus safeguarding national sovereignty. So when we look back, we can see that the European Union grew despite of or even because of crisis. And it did not fail because of national interests, but was even advanced by national interests. If necessary, by something what we would call today coalitions of willing. Pragmatism over idealism. The world has changed several times since 1945, and Europe adapted accordingly. But what does European activeness look like today? Europe no longer debates coal and steel. We debate energy independence, digital sovereignty and climate change, the safety of our children on global social media platforms, migration, our competitiveness and our economic role in the world, and finally, security and defense. Especially sensitive areas such as foreign policy and military questions are controlled by EU member states. If the EU wants to take action in these areas, it needs to get all 27 members on board. Just a single veto stops the EU from action. There's a strong agreement in Brussels that the EU institutions need to reform. But for now, that's rather unlikely, since real reforms would require a change of the treaties. But that would open the Pandora's box and take 4 years. So for the moment, there is no real appetite, neither in the European capitals, nor here at the European Parliament. The only workaround for such dead ends is that individual EU member states take action. If not as a whole, then in smaller groups and in selected areas. They need to become trailblazers again, as they did with the Schengen area and the euro. The latest surveys show 86% of Europeans want the EU to have a stronger voice on the international stage. And 66% want the EU to play a more protective role. Europeans would like to see the EU active in 3 main areas. 29% name energy and infrastructure, 32% say economy and industry, and most importantly, 40% want the EU to be more active in security and defense. Today, we do not talk about steel and coal anymore. We talk about a real defense union. We talk about drone walls, fighter jets. We talk about Article 42.7, which is the European Union's mutual defense clause. Not only NATO has one, but the European Union as well. But we also need to finally get our act together and consolidate our industries, our capital markets, to complete the single market. It's not a new treaty for a United States of Europe that we need, but concrete projects. It's about European projects of common interests. But that requires political will, like in 1951. That requires bold national leadership. Not for lofty idealism, but for our all material interests.